the Messiah. I am Marvel Jesus.
I think it's safe to say that Marvel hasn't exactly been the same since Endgame, and there's been no shortage of videos on why Marvel is struggling. I mean, even I made one that you can check out somewhere around here, but that's not the point of this video. This is all about how to save Marvel, because Marvel needs a plan.
We need a plan of attack.
I have a plan. Attack.
So today, I'm gonna lay out a 5-step plan, with number 5 being the most important, and then I'm gonna tell you how Marvel can accomplish all of those steps by pulling a phase 1. I'll explain what that means in a little bit, but for now, step 1, slow down. When you look at the biggest difference between how Marvel operates now compared to the Infinity Saga, it's the speed at which they're developing projects. Now, I know I'm not saying anything new here. The MCU has turned into quantity over quality is something you've probably heard 1,000 times already, but I still have to bring it up here because it's true. And given the situation Marvel is in, now, more than ever, they need to really focus on getting things right. If Marvel is going to win audiences back, they need some big wins. And that's only going to come from truly great films. You know, instead of pumping out 8 projects a year, take your time to put your best foot forward and really make something that is going to be remembered. And the thing that's funny about this is that Marvel actually did this for a really long time.
But since Marvel just can't stop making quality movies, it's exciting and it's humbling, and it's an honor to jump back into it.
You know how in every generation you have that one franchise or series of films that becomes timeless, defines the generation, and lives on for decades to come? For a certain generation, that was Star Wars. For another generation, that was Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. But for the 2010s, without question, that was the Infinity Saga. And while some people might not agree with this, I do think that 20 or 30 years from now, people will still come back and watch that run of films from Iron Man to Endgame. I just don't know that I could say the same thing for the stuff that Marvel's put out since then. And that raises a really important question. What's the point? What's the point in rushing to put out 8 projects a year if they're all gonna be forgotten about by the next week? Instead, I think Marvel should take as much time as it needs, even if that means putting out just 1 or 2 projects a year, as long as they're putting their best foot forward to deliver something truly great.
Give yourself the time, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, a year, to make something that's gonna last forever.
Now, we all know that one of the main drivers of this influx in content has been Disney+. Speaking of which, step 2, stop the Disney Plus shows. Kind of. Now, I really like the idea of Marvel branching out into television. I think it gave them a new creative format to tell stories, and they were able to explore certain things like WandaVision, for example, that they simply couldn't do in a 2-hour film. But overall, Disney Plus has done more harm than good to the MCU. Now, we've already touched on the quantity problems that come with Disney Plus, so I'm not going to focus on that here, but rather on something that has only become clear to me more recently. And that is, when looking back, I'm not sure it was ever a good idea to start having the MCU go back and forth between movies and TV shows. It's one thing to ask your audience to keep up with a series of films. You gotta watch movie 5 before movie 6, Age of Ultron before Civil War. But it's a completely different thing to ask your audience to sign up for a streaming service and watch hours of television just to understand the next movie. And when those movies start to feel impenetrable to those who haven't watched the prerequisite TV shows, it causes some pretty big issues. Like if you went into Doctor Strange 2 without having seen WandaVision, you'd be completely lost. And we've even seen this start to hurt the MCU financially, as The Marvels, which is a follow-up to both WandaVision and Miss Marvel, ended up becoming the lowest grossing film in the entire franchise.
He thinks he failed, which of course he did, but you know, there's a lot of that going around, ain't there?
So I think the MCU should stop the Disney Plus shows entirely, at least for a little while. Because frankly, if you're trying to win audiences back and reignite the MCU, I don't think you're going to be doing that on Disney Plus, and you'd be better off focusing all that time and resources on the movies. But if Disney really wants to continue making Marvel shows, they should at least have them be non-mandatory viewing for the movies. And there's some really good examples of this. Marvel itself, back during the Infinity Saga, had the Marvel Netflix shows like Daredevil and Punisher that were technically set in the MCU, but not really. Like, you never had to worry about catching up on a new season of Daredevil in order to understand the next Avengers film. It was extra content for Marvel fans to watch if they wanted to, but it wasn't something that would prevent people from understanding future movies. Or we could even look to the Dune franchise, which is now coming out with its own show called Dune Prophecy for HBO Max. The show is very much set in the world of Dune, but since it takes place 10,000 years before Paul Atreides, it's not going to be mandatory viewing for people before they go see Dune Part 3. Marvel could do something similar, like giving us shows set in the past, perhaps about Odin's conquest of the 9 realms, which could actually be really cool if you think about it, but it's a move that would allow Disney to make more Marvel content without audiences feeling like it's the end of the world if they don't see it.
This is what the end of the world looks like.
And about the end of the world, step 3, stop trying to end the world. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the stakes being too high was never an issue during the Infinity Saga. Like, we had Thor: The Dark World where Elfman was gonna plunge the 9 realms into eternal darkness or whatever, but it seems to be happening more frequently as of late, and there's a couple issues with that. Firstly, when the fate of the universe is at stake every 2 weeks, it starts to lose some of its impact. Beyond that, it's also not very believable. Unlike during an Avengers film where we understand that the heroes could actually lose, we know you're not gonna kill off the entire universe in a solo film. Like, remember during the Eternals when the stakes were that the planet would explode when a celestial baby was born?
The sudden return of the population provided the necessary energy for the emergence to begin.
Yeah, we all knew that was never going to happen. But even more importantly than that, it's just not the most effective way to raise audiences' investment in the story. At the end of the day, audiences care about the characters. That's why during Civil War, nope, not that one, there we go. Even though there was no world-ending threat, we felt so much tension because we cared about the relationship between these two characters. Or during Logan, where the stakes simply revolve around one little girl's life, we care so much because of the relationship between Logan and his daughter. Now, I'm not saying that big stakes equals bad. During an Avengers film where you need a threat big enough to justify bringing all of these heroes together, it makes complete sense. But even then, let me ask you, was the end of Infinity War so impactful because half of the entire universe got wiped away, or because your favorite character got wiped away?
I don't want to go. I don't want to go, sir. Please. Please, I don't want to go. I don't want to go.
So going forward, I hope Marvel really leans into the smaller, more personal stakes in the solo films and reserves the bigger, more world-ending threats for the Avengers films.
Avengers! Assemble.
And speaking of those Avengers films, step 4, put the team back together. Now, I went into detail on this on my video on why Marvel is struggling, but in short here, the Avengers films were like the glue that held this entire universe together. Throughout the entire Infinity Saga, we never went more than 5 movies without the Avengers crossing over. It was like a checkpoint that pulled all of our heroes together and put them back on the same page. But the plan for the multiverse saga is completely different. Supposedly, we're not getting any Avengers films until Doomsday and Secret Wars, which are basically the Infinity War and Endgame of this saga. But let's think about that for a second. While certainly some of the appeal of Infinity War was heroes meeting each other for the first time,
What master do you serve? What master do I serve? What am I supposed to say, Jesus?
most of our heroes had already built up relationships in 3 other movies before then. And especially when we got to Endgame, it was all about paying off those relationships that had been built up across several films. So personally, I think Marvel needs to put the Avengers back together even before Doomsday, so they can actually have some time together to build up those relationships. This will help Marvel to end off the multiverse saga in a more satisfying way, as we'll be more invested in these characters and their relationships if they actually have more time to develop. And not only will this help Marvel at the end of the multiverse saga, it'll also help them along the way in achieving step 5, focus. You know that feeling when you're watching a great TV show? When you finish up an episode and you can't wait to see what happens next? Yeah, that's what the MCU felt like during the Infinity Saga. Of course, we had individual movies that we enjoyed, but they were always clearly part of something much bigger that kept us coming back. Whether it was through the integration of Infinity Stones, or even just a post-credit scene at the end of the movie, Marvel always found a way to make all of their projects feel part of the greater narrative. This is exactly what Marvel needs to get back to doing. The multiverse saga needs to actually have some build-up on the multiverse. But besides the Loki TV show, Multiverse of Madness, and Quantumania, there really hasn't been any. And without that strong sense of direction, fans are starting to skip out on projects, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Instead of having a plot line going on with Shang-Chi, another one here with the Eternals, something happening with Agatha, setting up Young Avengers, a Kingpin storyline, refocus. Let's get the MCU back to feeling like one story with different chapters, rather than 20 different stories that will eventually cross over, but in the meantime are just disconnected. Okay, so as promised, how does Marvel actually pull this off and put all of these steps into action? I believe it's by recreating Phase 1. Let me explain. It's important to look at Phase 1 because that was the phase that really got people excited about the MCU. Yeah, Phase 2 and 3 did a good job of maintaining and building upon that, but in terms of really getting people hooked onto the MCU, something Marvel desperately needs right now, that was done in Phase 1. And here's what's interesting about that. Generally speaking, the first Iron Man and the first Avengers film are beloved. The first Captain America film is seen as solid. But Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, and the first Thor movie all got somewhat mixed reviews, and to this day are in a lot of people's bottom 10 MCU films. And yet, Phase 1 still worked incredibly well. So what are the principles that allowed for this? Well, number one, they had a clear through line. Every single film in Phase 1 ended by setting up the Avengers. Nick Fury popped up in almost every film as the connective tissue showing that each of these stories was heading to something greater. Secondly, they also focused on their main stars. The only characters that got movies in Phase 1 were Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, and Captain America. There was no spin-off Disney Plus shows or movies about Iron Man's best friend or Thor's best friend. They kept the focus on the main core members of the Avengers and slowly built up towards a team-up film that pulled this entire world together. So what would that look like with the present-day MCU? Well, just like in Phase 1, we take our star characters, which I would now say are probably your Spider-Mans, your Doctor Stranges, your Thors, your Wandas. For those of you saying she's dead, no, your Fantastic Four, since that's right around the corner, and maybe even throw Shang-Chi in there because people really like the first film. Then, take your time and give each of them solo films that are clearly building up towards a crossover that pulls these heroes together and gives the MCU the connectivity that it desperately needs. And just like in Phase 1, we can have someone go around recruiting these heroes. Now, instead of Nick Fury, I think someone like Doctor Strange or Wong would make a lot more sense here, given that they're a bit more tapped into the multiverse after the events of Doctor Strange 2. I think this would be the best way for Marvel to get fans excited about the MCU once again. Focus on your star characters, take your time to make their solo films the best they can possibly be, and have a clear goal that all of this is building up to, just like they did in Phase 1. So those are all my thoughts on how to save the MCU, but if you want to see why Marvel was struggling in the first place, click right here. And if you've already watched that, check out why I think Marvel should reboot after Secret Wars. And if you've already seen that, then you should probably just subscribe.